Hi, my friends. Welcome to this episode. I'm so excited for you to meet today's guest. Today's guest is Dr. Adrian A. Haugabrook. He's the Executive Vice President and Managing Director for the Social Impact Collective at Southern New Hampshire University, also known as SNHU, in Manchester, New Hampshire. In his role, he provides executive leadership and strategic guidance in advancing SNHU's equity and social mobility agendas by leveraging existing offers and new innovations to learners across the globe. So that's his official bio. What you will hear and feel in this episode is like the incredible amount of wisdom that Adrian drops. You hear me mention this as well, but he and I ended up meeting in like one of my favorite ways to meet people is you end up just sitting next to somebody in a place where you're with strangers that become neighbors, become friends. He and I were sitting together in a nonprofit volunteer day. We started talking and just the conversation was incredible. And since then, there have been a lot of points of connection. He ended up, of course, as the small world type energy brings you, he ended up being extremely close with one of my absolute favorite people that I worked with. And I mentioned in this, he was also a few weeks after we met, the first face that we saw when my sister and I went to go and check out a potential college opportunity for her. So this is just such a beautiful episode because I'm excited for you to get to meet him. The incredible work that he is doing right now and has been doing for such a long time is getting the visibility that it deserves and hopefully more, because what he talks about in this episode is game-changing stuff around educational access, but just our own relationship to time, our own relationship to value, worth, and how we show up in the world. So many of us have been taught and told that there's a specific way of being seen as a viable member of society, a productive member of society, and that's to go to school, get good grades, go to a good college, get a good job. If you can go to, get your master's or your PhD, that's even better. And all of these criteria that signify to the world that you are capable and successful. In this episode, we talk about how we might be able to create a life and a future moving forward where each and every one of us feel just as valuable and successful by honoring the life experiences we have that equate to those master's and PhD level things, to that the credits in school, to so much more than just how we've had on paper credentialing looking like and certification looking like. We talk a lot about what a new paradigm would look like where we can remove some of the gatekeeping energy and what it would be like to really bring people's diverse experiences to the table to allow for innovation to thrive. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, I think you're gonna love this episode and I cannot wait for you to meet Adrian. So without further ado, let's get this started. Adrian, welcome to Checkbox Other. I am beyond happy you're here. As most of you know, usually I get so excited that my body's going all over the place. Just so you all have a heads up, I've already gone through like the heat of the extreme like desert climate of excitement and then the chills of all the truth and amazingness. So we will be going on a roller coaster together of that. And my face already hurts from smiling so much. So just a quick heads up for what your next hour or so is all about. Adrian, I'm so happy you're here. I would love for the listeners to hear your story. I call it a Cliff Notes version, the twists, the turns, the aha moments that have led you to who you are and where you are today.
Wow, Nikki, thank you. This is awesome. And I've probably modulated through all those emotions that you have as well, but it's good to be back in sync with you.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say the Cliff Note version of this, I'm going to draw on a particular experience. And it's an experience that wasn't at the beginning of my career. But it was actually at this inflection point where I've been working on my dissertation, and my dissertation was focusing on, those what we call the non-cognitive factors. So cognitive factors are, GPA, SAT scores, class rank, those kinds of things. But I was looking at factors that non-cognitive factors that were better predictors or the best predictors of how well someone like me, a person of color in American higher education or in secondary, how well I might do in college, meaning will I not only attend, but would I persist and to graduate? And of course, I found that I was correct, that the SAT scores and all that were not the best predictors. It was at that moment, as I was doing that research, and at the time I was an assistant dean at one of the universities in Boston, and my whole career for the 13 years leading up to that had been in higher education. And at that point, I realized that in higher education, we spend, traditionally 4, 5, 6 years to transform a student's life.
Yeah.
But I realized that there were a bunch of lives that were never making it to the doorsteps of American higher education. And if I wanted to, sort of uphold my own purpose and mission in life, which is to have the greatest impact on equity and opportunity that I could, then sitting in that higher ed space wasn't the place to do it. I had to find some place and space to actually improve the entire trajectory of the learning process, to really create those expectations that post-secondary was not only available, but it was accessible. And so creating that opportunity was what really sort of catapulted me into this broader body of work.
It's wonderful. And, it's funny when we're in our own lived experience and we're trying our best to kind of chart forward and find the path while also keeping the kind of larger picture in play. And those
Yeah.
moments of discovery for ourselves have such a much larger ripple effect of,
Right.
me having this experience and the people in my world having this experience. And then if we keep kind of looking out layer by layer, realizing, okay, there are barriers that may or may not be impacting me, but are for sure impacting the larger system. And so I'm just so amped for this conversation. So I feel like we dropped so many nuggets of wisdom that came up as you were kind of charting your path forward and looking in all directions, not just
Right.
not just forward with blinders on. That tends to be a lot of the way that systems and structures are set up for us to just keep striving to go for that next step forward and not necessarily look around who's with us, who
Right.
isn't with us. So one of the main question that I start with here is, can you tell us about a time, or if you have more than one time, you're more than welcome to bring it, where you have felt other, different, or as though you don't belong?
I can think of two, and it's just two of many, but the first was, so I grew up, my father being in the United States Air Force. And so we literally lived all over the world. And in fact, and I'm telling a little bit of my age, at the time that we moved back to the US, and it was the late 70s, I was almost getting ready to head to high school. But as you know, the military was one of the first fully integrated institutions in American society. And so a combination of living outside of the US
Right.
at a period of time when civil rights and desegregation and all those things were in play, as well as being in a fully integrated institution, when we came back to the United States, again, as an almost high schooler, and we moved to Georgia because both of my parents are from Georgia, the first time that I experienced other was actually my mother and father sitting me down as we had moved back to Georgia before I went to my first day of school. And they said, "We're in a different place now.
Mm.
And you will witness and feel the difference." And it wasn't something that they were trying to speak into an existence.
Right.
They were actually telling the reality of things.
Yeah.
And so that otherness was when I really fully began to understand that even inside institutions that feel or sense a bit of protection, that there are other institutional effects that are at play.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the experiences. And then the second one that I would say is one that actually looking back, and I still reflect back on this, even to this day, even at the age that I am now. I'm not about, I can say it if I want to, but
You're more than welcome.
I'm a little bit older than I might look or even sound. But the representation in media at the time that I was growing up, and not just growing up, but even into my early adult years, and even into my latter part of my adult years, and even until now, and thinking about how someone like me who looks like me was represented.
Yeah.
And so going all the way back to, the only thing that we could be in movies were, you know, pimps or enslaved people or this or that. And even thinking about how much consternation there was when, the Cosby Show came out. It's like, oh, there are no Black families that are like that. That's a mythical family,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
But for folks like me, at that point in time, there were other shows, and then we started seeing, fashion and culture beginning to shift, and how this new rap thing, this is bad, and all this stuff and now these are the things that have been built by folks who look like me,
Yeah.
and have become embedded in the culture. And
Yeah.
so anyway, the representation piece, which was very difficult, and also particularly for someone who looks like me, who's in darker complexion, then I was really seen as other.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting because when you have a space and a place where you're growing up in your formative years that isn't mirroring the separateness that you're talking about, and then you're in your teenage years where at that point you think you have your whole sense of self figured out,
Right.
entering a whole new arena, and then having the people that love you, care about you, have been your constant, sharing with you, all right, I'm not trying to scare you. I just want to level with you and tell you this is what we're entering. This is where you're entering.
Yeah.
There is, I can only imagine that it's creating a sense of, uh, I don't know, there's like a sense of responsibility to understand the world as it is and separate yourself from that meaning at an age where, like, in our teenage years, we're absorbing the world from a very selfish perspective oftentimes.
Sure.
Right? Our hormones are making us just look at ourselves.
Right.
And so being able to see the world around you in so many different ways up until that point, and then having, the space that was the kind of discovery of other, or that introduction, be with people that had you feeling safe and secure. Oftentimes, I will say, on the podcast, when people are sharing their other experiences, it isn't so it's not in such a held environment. And so I wonder how that had you kind of associating that learning and that knowledge and that kind of sense of place within society.
Yeah. There's something that you said, Nikki, that just really jumped out at me.
Hmm.
Um, and that space is also a place where you can either feel a sense of other, or you can feel a sense of security. And those are some of the things that I was observing at that time. So, coming from the military and living, pretty much outside the US during those times, we never I never remember a place or a space where I could not be
Mm.
until we moved here. Then you started noticing that there was a space where you could congregate as a whole, but then there were spaces where you went to for security,
Right.
and then there were spaces that you were not allowed to go to,
Okay.
either in spoken or unspoken terms.
Yeah.
And so for me, one of the things that I have grown up with, as a part of that, and thinking about how my parents and others, whether you call them elders or those who are wiser, they could be the same age and still be
Yeah.
wiser, are some of the things that they taught me about, all space. Every space is a space in which you can dwell. It's a
Mm.
matter of how you get into that space, and how you engage in that space. So whether it's the proverbial white fountain, colored fountain,
Right.
whether you drink from either of those, or if there's something about in the professional spaces where you are,
Yeah.
and particularly in those places and spaces where you walk in and you're like, I don't see anyone who looks like me.
Yeah.
But the security in that is the confidence that those folks built in me to be able to say, well, if that's not what you see, then find something that you can connect with.
Yes.
And then from there, you find some points of resonance.
That's beautiful. On so many levels, that's beautiful, because I feel like where we are right now, um, is this choice of, will I double down in division and separateness, or will I seek to find connection?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the powers that be have realized that the way that I keep my power is to keep everybody else divided. And so we consume, as you're talking about before, of like the representation in entertainment, in stories that are being told about people. But now media has this sense of like, even when we're telling the news, are we telling the news, or are we telling up a made up version of how we skew the news? And
Right.
how that has us viewing our ability as human beings to tap into that muscle of connection
Right.
that, you know, at least in the coaching that I do, I'm like, we're built as human beings to be in community with each other. That's like part of like the animals that we are built to be with one another, not to
Right.
fight against each other. And unfortunately, what's been happening is there's so much airtime around division and so much airtime around, in order for you to be valued, you must be seen by the people that look like you, act like you, talk like you, have shared experiences that you do, that other people that haven't had that will not even give the time of day to make that connection. And in
Right.
reality, so many of us have lived an experience where like, isn't that what it is to be human and enter new spaces, that we do need to find things that are activating our shared humanity? We might look exactly the same, but there could be significant
Significant.
differences in
Yes.
that sameness too.
That is so true. One of the things that HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, are really becoming celebrated spaces and places now. And they should have been for many years, but now they're really coming forward. And both of my children went to HBCUs. They grew up in Massachusetts with, Southern roots. Um, they know their family, they know their history, but by virtue of the place or the spaces in which they grew up, my son, who is this handsome, athletic, big guy, grew up playing ice hockey as well as football, baseball, and other things, but was a near elite athlete as an ice hockey skateboarder, all of this, right? And smart guy.
Yeah.
He goes off to an HBCU, and one might think, we as African Americans are a monolith, but he finds his crew. He finds skateboarders. So it drives the point that you're making, that even in our own cultural spaces and places, that the differences in who we are the points that help us connect.
Right.
And how does that transcend outside of those cultural spaces?
Right.
How do we do that with other people as well?
And I love too, my goodness, the kind of activating factor of finding that semblance of confidence and safety within yourself so you can show that part. Because I think oftentimes what's happening, if we're afraid to show up in any kind of way that we're showing a part of ourselves that might be different, we don't actually allow for that connection to happen because we're hiding it behind our armor.
Yeah.
And so giving yourself the permission to believe that that space is made for you, even if it doesn't look like it, gives you the opportunity to kind of create connections that might, be behind the scenes that you would never see if not for opening it.
Right.
So I love that. One of the things that, and well, you and I, I'm sure I'll probably do a little bit about this in the intro, but I love so much. You and I met at a volunteer day. We were sitting next to each other at a table, and as I assume you do as well as I do all the time, we sparked up conversation with each other and had such a wonderful, like, deep conversation over, like, I feel it was like a Thanksgiving Day thing of,
that's right. Yeah.
kind of energy.
Yeah.
And I just remember being like, this man brings so much positive energy wherever he goes, but also brings a level of depth that, like, I'm not used to with just talking to a stranger, even no matter where I am, at an event or otherwise. And then that was also the kismet of all of this, was also that a couple weeks later or so, my sister was going to the school that you worked at to potentially go to school there.
Yeah.
And I remember walking into the kind of new student or potential student orientation, and the introduction of who you were and are and your role was to create a space of welcoming, acceptance, and belonging. on day one.
Yeah.
And that was like, you're like, hi, I'm Adrian. And this is this is what we're about here. And so I think there is such a, this was 10 years ago, probably. Oh, see, we were talking about not trying to make
Wow.
ourselves feel like time went by too fast. But it was a
So the
long time
listeners are
ago.
going to start doing that deductive
Yeah,
reasoning
yeah,
and say,
yeah.
okay, Adrian said something about the 70s. Nikki said something about 10 years ago, and start doing the calculus, and they're going to come up.
Oh, stop, everyone. You don't need to. You don't need to.
Right.
Um, I think it's so fascinating because at the time, that wasn't something that was, I was going on college visits with my sister a lot. And it
Sure.
wasn't the entry point that you usually had. It was like you started with, what were your SAT scores? What kind of qualifications do you want? Here are all the elements, kind of the transactional elements of this space
Right.
that you can get when you come here. And I just remember being so profoundly impacted by the entry being like a warm welcome into your home that you would want, of like, here is how we operate, here's how what we prioritize.
Yeah.
And to have a role that was really about creating a sense of belonging from the first moment you got somewhere.
Yes.
I can only imagine how much it impacted you doing that each and every day, but I can say, as somebody that was not even the primary audience, it was something that had me realizing, oh my goodness, this is something that is a job that people can do. People can be actively creating these spaces and welcoming people in. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like? Again, now we hear people doing, workplace well-being and belonging and all of that.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, I guess if we're going to bring that timing into it, the people that were going into school at that time are now in the workplace. And so having that type of support is so important, to the point where the US Surgeon General, like 2 weeks ago, came out with a report that mental health and well-being is one of the biggest issues that workplaces need to create support around. So
Right.
as you think about that role 10 years ago or whatever it was, and where we are now, can you talk a little bit about what that was like for you in the time and the evolution of that till now?
Yeah. So the thing that I will say is that it wasn't a job. It was actually like it was almost like a ministry. And the reason I say
I like that.
no, the reason I say that is because the role that I was in at the time was I was the vice president for student success and engagement.
Yes.
And the earlier story that I shared with you about that pivotal point in my career, when I realized that if I were only spending that time in the college setting and not affecting the whole trajectory of the experience, that was a culmination of that experience in those moments. Because what I didn't say was that at that point, I left higher education after 13 years. And for 7 years, I went and worked in the after school, middle school space. And then I started working in the high school, middle school, college access, college readiness space. And then came back into higher education, taking all those through lines and building what we call the student success model that really met the student where she, he, or they were, versus trying to build, instead of asking them, are you college ready? We flipped it and said to the institution, are you actually student ready? And so when you flip that and you really begin to locate the student at the center of everything, and then build around that student or that learner experience, that's when you begin to know and recognize that, it's not about your SAT scores, it's about your own experiences. And how do you bring those experiences into your learning, and how does that get represented in the demonstration of not just what you know, but what you know how to do?
Yes.
And so when you do that, then you get someone at least at that point in time. Now you're right, there's a proliferation of lots of folks who do this. That's when you get that VP for student success and engagement doing the welcome or engaging people into that experience, instead of an admissions application
Right.
that says you don't belong here.
Right. The
Yeah.
kind of cold open of fill out
Yeah.
this form, get your number. It's like kind
Right.
of going up to the count, like the deli counter at
You're
the
right.
supermarket.
Right.
Instead of you like, okay, I guess I'll get a number and you'll only refer to me as that number and the food I'm ordering, not the person that I am
Yeah.
interacting with you. Okay.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
No, exactly.
And
Exactly.
it's funny too, because I think that though there are a lot of titles that are along that line now, that shift, that mentality shift is still something that we need collectively as a culture for sure.
Yeah.
But like we can call ourselves that, but if we are still trying to fit people into a mold of what a student is supposed to look like and calling it welcoming and success and belonging, but
Hmm.
still saying, okay, but in order to belong, let's shift and change you. And I'll help you do that. You won't have to do that by yourself. It still creates this dissonance of when you have to go out into the world, no matter where, what stage you're going out into the world to operate as yourself. And so it does create kind of that chasm. One of the things that you have a wonderful TED talk and it's 15 minutes long. And I was like, so this feels like I just read an entire like academic book about something. One of my absolute favorite elements of that had me going, okay, out loud. Was you're talking about the tyranny of time, but this
Mhm.
also belief that experience doesn't necessarily equate to everyone having the exact same experience in order for it to be viable to reach the goals that we're trying to reach for on the other side.
Exactly.
So can you talk a little bit about, I mean, talking about how like lived experience for people entering higher education, entering college, the university spaces can actually be used as for credit versus having people who haven't necessarily been on the trajectory or path that's been expected coming
Right.
into school and saying, all right, well, you got to start 4 years. You have 4 years from today. Can you talk a little bit about how, again, this feels like such a significant mindset shift that
Sure.
you've been working towards and bringing voice to has such a big impact on people feeling as though if they are looking to strive for higher education,
Yeah.
this is something that is a lot more accessible.
Yeah. No, there's a lot that's there. And in the TED Talk, which is getting pretty close to 2 million views now. So I just
Okay,
checked just a little bit a while ago. Got a million views in the first six weeks, but
no big
um
deal.
no, I was shocked. I was like, oh my gosh, people are listening to what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's a piece to this. So in that TED talk, when I was talking about the tyranny of time, I was talking about how in a traditional post-secondary or college or university setting, time is immovable. It is fixed. It is, semester is this long, a credit requires this many hours, and all of that. And so everything is focused around time. Even how you or me or how the learner or that student actually approaches his, her, or their work. It's got to be calculated in time.
Yeah.
But if we were to disrupt that and say that, you know what, no, let's turn that around. Let's make learning fixed, which means that learner is at the center and then everything else is designed around that. And so then we break that tyranny of time. And the other piece of this is, so when I was at my previous institution and we were doing this work around student success and engagement, we did some analysis. And because we had a very traditional way of awarding scholarships, which were mostly merit-based scholarships, and you had a few need-based scholarships. But when we looked at our data, we saw that a majority of the students that were coming in, one, the SATs and all that stuff did not predict how well they would do.
Right.
But you know what we found were great predictors for how well they would do? Were they taking care of someone else in their family, someone older or younger? Did they work while they were in high school? Um, those kinds of things, and not the kinds of things were they the president of their student class,
Right.
which is good. I'm not discounting that. But when you were actually doing the work of your heart and your head with your hands, that translated into a demonstration of what I know how to do.
Mm.
And so when you take that and you bring that into the learning environment and you look at it instead of from a credit perspective, how many credits can you get? It's more about what are you competent in,
Yeah,
then it flips the paradigm.
for
And I
sure.
often say, sometimes in a joking way, but in a very real way, the thing about skills and competencies in the TED Talk, I talk about, let's build a global skills bank,
Yeah.
because skills are agnostic as to where you got them.
Yes.
The evidence, the evidence of the skills, the demonstration of those skills can be measured in very much the same way. So you could have gotten your financial management skills by serving as a store manager or floor manager at Walmart.
Yeah.
You may have also gotten your financial management skills running numbers for a local gang,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But you create new opportunities when you assign this kind of validation or this credential or credibility for this credential, which doesn't say, well, because you ran numbers,
Right.
you're not going to get it. And because you were a floor manager, you will. It becomes this equalizer.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I feel my push
Yeah.
is really to democratize learning.
Yeah.
And through the democratization of learning, you now are creating a groundswell of opportunity, and you're bringing equity into play.
Yes. I love it. Just so I was making all these noises and shaking my head so much because I just got off a coaching call with someone and we were talking about that because I work with a lot of people that are trying to pivot in their careers.
Mm,
And oftentimes, when you have something as concrete as a job description with bullets of criteria of what your qualifications are, and you're making a change in your career that might not have followed the last 20 years of what another person in that career that knew it when they were 18
right.
doing, does that make you more or less of a viable candidate for the role?
Mm,
And what's been so fascinating is that I have witnessed many of my clients pivoting into new spaces, and the reception that they've gotten from the organizations that are valuing the transferable skills
mhm.
is tenfold, because not only can you do this thing, but you're bringing a completely different perspective to what we're doing, so that innovation is able to be built into being able to achieve the goals. You're also
Right.
then expanding the possibilities of what we can do with the processes we've already done before, or the ones that are so outdated that we don't even know how to recreate them so it helps people. You're coming with a whole different perspective, with a fresh lens, a fresh eye, and also fresh energy. Because if you're making that pivot, it's because you really believe it's something that's more aligned with who you are and where you want to go.
Right.
And so it really is fascinating to think about the fact that we've been living in the confines of like, this is the way you do this thing. And if you don't do it
Mm,
this way, then
yeah.
you, even if you get the right answer, it doesn't count. It reminds me of, I mean, I'm not someone that loves reading directions. Um, so it reminds me of like math problems where you'd have to tell, you'd have to write the answer, but you'd have to show your work.
Show
And the
your
way
work.
you showed your work was how the teacher taught you to show your work. But the way my brain works is not how the teacher taught me. I learned what you told me, great, cool. I can get the answer faster in my brain. My brain is built different. And that doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean what you told me was wrong. That probably works for a lot of people. But do you want me to actually like honestly show what my work was? Or do you want me to have the answer and then build how I got there so you can see how I got there?
Right.
Because it's a really, really fascinating thing that we're experiencing now, as we've been in the last few years of realizing how much these systems do not serve the majority of us,
Mhm.
wherever the us falls into play, that we've been following this traditional model of operating in our lives that has us losing so many unique parts of who we are that allow us to get to spaces faster or with much more energy and much more connection. And so I
Yeah.
think it's really, really fascinating to create a space that's like, I'm going to value how you're showing up and not necessarily how you got here as the criteria for do you belong here, which again
Right.
is going back to that space and place energy of like, if you're here, you're meant to be here. I don't need to gatekeep you based on you not going to the same school I went to or walking the exact same path that I walked.
Right. No, it's absolutely true. And I think a couple other things that you were talking about time earlier.
Yes.
And, for me, they're kind of like three dimensions of time as I think about it. And now, again, this is just Adrian's word. It may not apply to everyone.
That's okay.
But the first part of it is when I think of, people often use the phrase time management.
Yeah.
I would actually say, and I read this years ago, and it made sense to me then, but boy, did it make sense to me afterwards. But what the author was saying was that there's no such thing as time management. It's more about how do you manage yourself within the context of time. And so that again is a bit of a disruption, which means that it's less about I only have 20 minutes.
Yeah.
You're actually saying, what can I do in the time that I have? What impact or what can I do? And so that's one aspect of it. The second is for me thinking about reconciling time. And so when you think of what reconciliation is, reconciliation is bringing consistency or bringing harmony to something. And so much of what how we treat time or how time treats us, it does this, peaks and valleys and, sprints and then slowdowns and this, that, and the other. But how do you harmonize within time? And how can you bring better balance? It doesn't necessarily mean that it will be balanced, but sometimes, balance isn't 50-50. Sometimes balance is 70-30, but you've got the right allocations in the right places. You've got the right priorities, or you're striving for the right priorities in the right places. And that's what that harmonizing is. And then the third element of time is this urgency of now. And people kind of think of that urgency of now, and I know that the quotation is the fierce urgency of now. But the urgency of now, in my view, means that you can't affect the last minute that just passed. What you do in this minute will influence or inform the next minute or the next hour. And so what is it that you're doing with this time? And if you allow me, I'll just share something very quickly. Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, who was the former president of Morehouse years ago, and it becomes part of the Morehouse mantra. As I said, my son graduated from Morehouse, and he has a poem. It's called Just a Minute. And it goes this way. I've only just a minute, only 60 seconds in it, forced upon me, can't refuse it, didn't seek it, didn't choose it, but it's up to me to use it. I must suffer if I lose it, give an account if I abuse it, just a tiny little minute, but eternity is in it. That's that urgency of now. It's that second, which is now. It's that minute that you're in that is now. And so those three elements or dimensions of time for me are kind of how I like to think about all of this.
I love that. I also love that my body couldn't help but move to the rhythm of that, which is also if we give ourselves the freedom to understand that time is so much more than something that confines us, that there is an ease and a flow, and that you can, we're built to be able to operate alongside it, not battle against it.
True.
It's funny there's like a couple different things that are coming up, but specifically in the women's leadership work that I've done one of the main principles is really breaking this belief that time equals money and how we value ourselves, how we value one another. And so I think living in a society that really does have time equaling money, success, viability, and also like you're talking about seniority, and you've been somewhere long enough, so therefore you are the person to do it, even if you might not be, or you've worked at a place for 5 years, so you should be a manager, whether you want to be a manager or not, whether you actually have the skills, interests, and strengths to do that. That's how we do this. And so this very detached relationship that we have with time and trying to make it currency, when also at the same time, that really is the time. I always talk about our time and our energy are the real currency we have.
Yeah.
And so money gets kind of bucketed in there in a capitalist structure for sure. But it's really interesting of trying to understand how can I kind of reclaim my relationship with time so that I can leverage it to serve me in a way that feels like I'm not constantly behind. I'm not constantly operating in
Yeah.
fear. I'm not
Yeah.
constantly battling with my enoughness because I'm supposed to be somewhere different than I am right now at this time, this many years in, or this much time in. I can't take that much, or I did this faster than it's expected. So look how much better I am for that. This
Right.
this belief that time is also creating a semblance of hierarchy is its own bizarre dance that we are in. And especially after the last few years of what I talk about is like time has just completely shifted and changed our relationship to time over the last 3 years of not really having agency over where we can be and what we can do, and also how much, 10 days to 10 years, it feels like I just saw you, but it also feels like it was 15 years ago I saw you.
Yeah.
How does that kind of mental relationship with time shift as well? And are you giving yourself permission for that fluidity and that harmony to try to like equalize and find itself as we're trying to
Yeah.
navigate all the shifts and changes that are happening?
Yeah. And with that, the very points that you just made, I would say, I would offer this.
Yeah.
Um, is time the currency? And so when you think about the definition of currency,
Yeah.
or the attributes of currency, currency is a tool or vehicle or an object that conveys a certain amount of value,
Mm,
right? And as we know, currency exchange rates can go up and down based
yeah.
on a whole host of other factors, right?
Yeah.
And so currency, reflects a sense of value, or how much it's worth, or not. So if we were to flip, one of the things that I think for me, this pandemic, that's now an endemic, has shown me, is that like time, like people don't have a clear sense of time anymore, right? Like you said, was it yesterday that? No, actually, that was 3 weeks. No, that was last year,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
there's no sense of that. But what we do have a sense of? We have a sense of self. And so if we were to see ourselves as the currency, that we are the vehicle for the exchange in both relationships, how we interpret time, or how we live within time, how we live our professional lives, how we live our social lives, how we live our personal lives, our interpersonal lives. That's where I think the currency is. I'm not saying that time is not currency. I'm just saying that this is where, as we were sharing earlier, I know that there was a lot of pain over the last few years. There was a lot of loss. And there was also a lot of, what? I'm completely repositioning my life. And this isn't from a position of privilege. People all across the spectrums were saying, you know what? There's something different. There's something different for me, in this. And so, what value can I bring to that?
Yeah. And can I give myself permission to change or to be curious or
Yeah.
to try to like sit in the middle for it to figure itself out rather than
Right.
having to be certain right away? Because I do think there is a part of this that when we don't know something and we've been in a state of don't know something, like every person didn't really know how to handle this, that we want to like short circuit to the answer to find some semblance of control and comfort.
Yeah.
But when we allow ourselves the ability to say, all right, I don't know the answer, but I trust that I can get there. And that answer for me might be that different than for you. And giving that freedom is really powerful and important. And that again, the kind of great equalizer and also the great light shining on how inequitable our lives are right now and how our systems and societies are right now was that each and every one of us was forced to pause in some way and reflect on our sense of self, our sense of safety, our sense of connection.
Mm,
Um, when the air you're breathing is seen as a threat, it has you just viewing the life that you're leading in a very different way. When
right.
you're dealing with collective loss and grief, it has you dealing with emotions that some people may have never actually truly felt before.
True.
When you're actually losing close people very close to you, there is so much about grappling with impermanence and grief and loss that has you understanding what you value in this world and what you want to do with the
Mm,
time, energy, and relationships you have.
yeah.
How you show up in that. I love that of like
Right.
shifting it and saying, all right, what do you want to do? What do you want to do with with all that you get to bring to the party? I
Right.
think is really, really powerful. I feel like there's so many things that I want to ask you about. I think one of the things that I'm so curious about, especially after watching it, well, I should say this, after hearing what you're saying and you doing this work of like paradigm shifting for years,
Yeah.
how has it been in response to, I mean, the higher education, secondary education, just education in general has been not always known as fast moving in evolution, but also very kind of traditional in structure for a very long time. And uh, there is a level of kind of obedience and abiding by the way things have always been done.
Yeah.
What has been the reaction and response as you're kind of planting seeds and creating conversation around how we might be able to kind of chart a new frontier forward?
Yeah, I would say first of all that the I is really we. There are a number of people and organizations and institutions that are in this movement.
Yeah.
And it's not just higher education as well. You're seeing employers, you're even seeing the public. I'm talking about the global public who are saying, well, what is the value of the work that you're doing? You have to show me, and so that savviness, I call it savviness, not sassiness, that savviness is really calling to question, okay, well, what is the model and how, if A plus B equals this, then how do I know that it truly is a value, which they're saying is it really relevant to me? And so with that as kind of the prelude, you're seeing a growing number of institutions, organizations who are saying out loud the very thing that you're saying. Wow, we are so slow in, with innovation, with our practice, with how we teach, how we do all of this. And you're seeing more and more institutions and organizations who are not only talking about it, but are actually trying to build structures to support it.
Yeah.
And the important part of all of this is the structure, infrastructure, and systems. Just as systems can be detrimental in really influencing and informing inequities,
Right.
you're now seeing more institutions who are who are trying to democratize this and creating greater, not just access, but success for learners.
Okay.
So that's one thing that you're beginning to see. You see some institutions that are really standing up and saying, here's the ROI on so your return on investment equals this and looks like this. Even to the point where many of us are now beginning to say to those traditional compliance regulatory kinds of things that we have to quote report on,
Yeah.
we're now saying those aren't the right things to be measuring.
Yeah.
Right? Or that only tells you one piece of the story. It's not really telling you the fullness of it. And so you're starting to see that. The other piece that I mentioned earlier is that you're seeing more institutions that are asking the question, are we student ready versus are they college ready?
Yeah.
Something else that you're beginning to see, and I love this piece where, we've typically called it college or university,
Yes.
going off to college. But now you're beginning to hear more and more language that instead of saying that, they're talking about post-secondary pathways, because they realize that there are different journeys into how people engage in academic, social, or other lives after they finish their secondary experience.
Mm.
And that there are many pathways and many journeys in doing so. And so now we're also beginning, at least in the work that I get to do, is we're now saying, let's get rid of the language around 2-year and 4-year.
Right. Yeah.
Because some of the programs that we're running, we're actually seeing learners who are finishing their AA degrees, their associate degrees, in less than 6 months.
Ooh.
And completing their BAs in about 1.25 years.
Wow.
That doesn't make 2 and 4.
Right. Right.
That is an AA and a BA.
Right,
right?
right. Yeah.
And so we're starting to see a lot of that. And then the other thing that I'll say quickly is that um, how technology
Yeah.
has really advanced the agenda. And I'm talking about we're still on the conversation about the digital divide
Yeah.
that that divides the haves and the have-nots. But you're seeing more and more technology and what I call digital enablement that's allowing actually for even greater access.
Right.
And so now you have, technology companies who are saying, no, this is for the greater good.
Yes.
And so we are now supporting these technologies because it's going to create greater access. It's going to create greater opportunity and greater equity.
I love that so very much, especially being in Southern New Hampshire. And I mean, I feel like Southern New Hampshire was one of the first places that I ever heard of, and maybe University of Phoenix was the other place that I ever heard of online education. Again, this is years ago. Um, but but the last few years, like everybody had to go into some version of online education. And so how normalized that became in a system that, yeah, maybe it didn't evolve super fast usually, but kind of was forced to. And I always think of this, especially when I'm working with my clients, of like, well, I've never done that before. It's always been done this way. And one of the most powerful testimonies you can have is witnessing yourself actually be able to do something. And the last few years, we've witnessed ourselves be able to evolve and grow at a pace that many of us didn't think was possible, whether it be within ourselves or watching the collective world outside of us, that we thought was like, this was a rock that we were going to be pushing up a hill for a really long time. Just
Yeah.
witnessing how humans have such an amazing ability to evolve. And sometimes we evolve too far and have to swing ourselves back, and we have to find kind of a middle. But it's really, really fascinating to think about, the organization that you're at that was kind of at the forefront of talking about and normalizing this, and now having an industry that knows that it's the future, even if there are people that are kind of digging in their heels. And so I love that you're talking about kind of that technology divide, but also the accessibility, that it's becoming a collective responsibility to
Yes.
create those avenues of access. And
Right.
so I'm excited that you're doing this work, in this space with so many other people that are kind of moving the momentum forward. And the other part is, I feel like the timing of paradigm shift with the generational shifts that are happening in our culture, where there is a lot of momentum around how can we make these broken systems
Right.
either crumble away as though they should and then alchemize into what we need, or can we ask those questions at the very least and have conversation around them. So I'm
Yeah.
excited that 2 million people have set eyes on your talk, because that is encouraging and deepening the conversation. And I am so beyond excited that you joined today. How can people get in touch with you, follow you, keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at AK Haugabrook. So very easy. Same, my social media handle is the same all the way across.
Yeah.
Or you can email me at a.haugabrook@snhu.edu.
Perfect. And we will make sure we include all that on the show notes too, for anybody that didn't get it that fast. I'm so happy that you were here. This reunion felt so wonderful. I can't wait to see you in person. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you. So wonderful to be here.
What did I tell you? So much wisdom. I was sitting here being like, wait a second, I need to be taking notes. And I was like, oh, good, we record this so I can stay present. But there's so many incredible things, so many quotes that Adrian said. How about that poem he shared? My goodness. I literally, for those of you that are not watching the video of this, just picture as we were doing that, my body was literally swaying with the rhythm of that poem. It's beautiful. So happy that Adrian was able to join us today. I really hope that if you haven't yet, you give yourself a moment to watch his TED Talk. It's really amazing. Again, only 13 minutes, but it felt like it hit me much more than 13 minutes should have. So really excited to hear what you think about that. You can go to nikkyinnocent.com/podcast to find the show notes, where we have all the links for how you can get in touch with him and connect with him. And that's also a place for you to let us know what you thought of the episode, or if there's any other topics you want us to bring to the forefront, any guests that you want us to bring to the table. It's such a blessing to have you here with us. I said this in the episode, but like, I really, really value your time and your energy, knowing it is such an important part of what it is to be living as a human being right now. So for you to spend your time and the energy of listening to us, here with us today means so much to me. I cannot wait to catch you on the next episode, and I hope you have a wonderful day ahead.